Mike's not here tonight. Oh, he came. I have to add him now.
And I'll get it for you. My goal is to get new chairs.
Yeah, but he wasn't there a minute ago. He snuck in on me.
I think one of them is purple too.
Yeah.
I want new chairs. I want a new building. Huh? I want new chairs. I want a new building.
I wonder why the big...
You can work towards that. All right. Good evening, everybody. We're going to begin shortly. Please ensure your cell phones are off or on silent. Council members, ensure your microphones are turned on. I do want to remind anybody in the gallery, citizens, administration, department heads, that if you are addressing council, please step up to the mic. We have issues taking minutes, and then the media has reached out multiple times asking who's talking. So if you could, when you're addressing council, just step up to the podium. All right, today is Monday, April 24th, 2023. It is 6 o'clock, 6 p.m. This is a regular legislative meeting of Barberton City Council today. Before we begin the regular legislative meeting, we do have committee meetings this evening. So we will start with street, sidewalk, and lighting with Mrs. Angela.
No. It's parks.
Oh, I'm sorry, I'm looking at the wrong day here.
I was like,
Not now.
Let me just block out that whole thing so I don't look at it again. All right. We will start with city properties, parks with Mr. Jaber.
thank you, Mr. President. City Properties Park Recreation meeting today, April 24th at 6:01 p.m. Council chambers. All members are present, including myself as chair, Mr. Heidick, and Mrs. Fry. And guests are noted. We have one request for legislation. This will be with the streets also. A letter from Todd Shreve, Service Director, requesting legislation to enter a contract with Perrin Asphalt and Concrete for the asphalt paving portion of the 2023 street resurfacing program in Edgewood Park and Tuscarora Park pickleball courts. Emergency wording is requested. Any questions? We do have Mr. Patterson here if anybody has any questions, or also Mr. Shreve also. Any questions?
Sure.
Mr. Greer?
This is kind of a, revolves around this. I know that the Parks and Rec is doing a pickleball tournament, or being part of a pickleball tournament. Is that what it is? What is the interest that the citizens are showing in that activity?
I've had no emails or calls about the pickleball myself. I've seen it was posted to the parks. Has anybody else had any calls? Ms. Hansloff?
Yes, there's been quite a few people that have really showed interest in that, in the pickleball. That's why it's being, built there. But they are talking about tournaments, and there's a group, and they have tournaments, and they go all over to different communities and have a tournament. So it is a big deal. It's a big deal.
Mm-hmm. Mayor?
Yes, I've had several residents over the last few years contact me about pickleball. They've been in tournaments and leagues in other cities. And my understanding, some school systems in the area are actually teaching pickleball to the students. So yeah, this just continues to grow. So that's why I'm moving forward with it.
Ms.
I have a
Hansloff?
question. Ms. Jaber, what resurfacing are they doing at Edgewood Park? Is it the tennis courts, or what are they resurfacing at Edgewood Park?
Mr. Patterson?
It's the tennis courts.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Mr. Heidick?
Thank you, Chair. I have a two-part question here. First is for the resurfacing program and Edgewood and Tuscarora Park. Did we get some sort of discount by lumping those in with the resurfacing program?
On a bid, we did.
On the bid we did?
Yes.
Okay. And the second question is probably the one everybody wants to know. Do we have a street list?
So we assume that would be asked tonight, and we are working on putting that together. And it'll be emailed as soon as tomorrow. Mayor and I discussed that earlier, so we'll get it out to you guys.
Thank you. Thank you,
Ms.
Chair.
Hansloff?
Mr. Shreve, can you get us a copy or email us the bids?
So, I mean, I can. I'll have to talk to our engineering firm. So they do the bid tabulation. They put it all together and they give us a recommendation. So I will see what they can.
Do you know how many
put-
companies bid this?
There was two companies bid.
Two companies?
Yeah, it was a sealed bid, and Perrin and Barbicus were the two bidding companies.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Yep.
Any other questions? All right, a motion for this, please.
I'll make a motion.
And I'll second it.
All right, Mr. Heidick, Mrs. Fry, and vote please.
Aye.
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 Thank you. All right, we have one pending legislation. And we'll open this up for miscellaneous discussion. None? Nope. Anybody from chambers, council, nothing? All right, motion to adjourn, please.
Make that motion.
And I'll second it.
Mr. Heidick and Mrs. Fry. And we are adjourned at 6:05, and with that, I pass, sir.
Next up is public welfare and safety.
Thank you, Mr. President. It is Monday, April 24th, 2023. The time is 6:06, and I am bringing the Public Welfare and Safety Committee meeting to order. All members of my committee are here, which is myself as chair, and Shorter Griffin and Joyce Coburn are members of the committee. All other council members are present, as well as guests as noted on my sheet. We have one new piece of legislation to introduce today, and it is a request for legislation, a letter from Chief Stephen M. Iono, Barberton Fire Department, requesting council to sponsor legislation to allow the Barberton Fire Department to submit a grant request not to exceed $900,000 to the Barberton Community Foundation for the purchase of a fire engine to replace an outdated, it says 2009, E1 pumper. I think it's a 2004, isn't it?
It's 2000.
It's a 2000, okay. All right. That is currently the oldest engine in the fleet. Emergency wording has been requested. I spoke with Chief Iono earlier this week about going to the foundation, and they have already met with them, and I asked him about selling the old pumper truck and what they plan to do as far as, the price and how this is all going to work out. And he believes that they can sell the 2000 pumper for about $40,000. And the problem is that there was a hole in the fuel tank, and it also needed a new pump. Let me see. The city gets a better rating if we have trucks that are under 20 years old. And we could acquire this truck as built by September of this year. They are asking the Community Foundation for a grant for all or part of this price for the vehicle. He informed me that Station 2's bond will be up in 2029, and that will free up about $195,000 a year from the fire department. Chief Iono has also met with Jeremy, and Jeremy wants to go forward to lock in a decent rate. And Chief Iono also informed me that the new ambulances will be coming in soon. Do you have anything to add to what I said, or?
The only thing is with the vehicle, the truck that had the hole in the fuel tank and the pump replaced was the 2003 purple pumper.
Oh, the purple pumper, okay. I'm sorry.
And it's back
It's back in service?
It's in service, yes.
So the 2000 that we would be replacing, the only thing that is mechanically wrong with it is that it's 20 years old?
Yeah, I mean, pretty much it's still is a good reserve truck, but, at this point, we don't need extra trucks around. We like to keep, a pretty lean fleet, if you know what I mean.
Okay, thank you. Does anyone have any questions for the chief or anyone? Okay, do I have a motion to call for this?
I'll second.
Motion made by Mr. Griffin and seconded by Mrs. Coburn. All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. We have a couple pieces of pending legislation for tonight that we'll be voting on. The first is to enter into contract with Oriana House, and it's authorizing the mayor to enter into a one-year contract with Oriana House for the 2023 Community Corrections Contract. This is something that is done on a yearly basis. The next piece of legislation we'll be voting on tonight is to enter into contract for the Law Department's Defender's Office of Summit County, an ordinance authorizing the law director to enter into a one-year contract with the Legal Defender's Office of Summit County to provide legal representation to indigent persons in the amount of $170 per case and declaring an emergency. This is also something done every year. The last piece of legislation we'll be voting on tonight is presented by myself and Mr. Heidick, and it is to enter into contract with SNC Construction Company, LLC, an ordinance authorizing the mayor or his designee to enter into contract with SNC Construction Company, LLC, the lowest and/or best bidder for improvements to the Barberton Fire Station in the amount of $118,736, and declaring an emergency. I'm going to open it up now for any miscellaneous discussion. Does anybody have any questions? Hearing none, do I have a motion to adjourn?
I'll make that motion.
Motion made by Mrs. Coburn.
Question?
I beg your pardon?
Am I allowed to ask the question?
Yes, I didn't. I'm sorry. I didn't.
Perfect. How are you entering a contract, or how are any of you about that motion to adjourn when you don't even have the amount for the Oriana House? It's not written on here, so you're about to vote on something you don't know how much it costs? Just because
The
it's not
contract with
annually?
Oriana House is based on what services they provide, and we already got those
So
a couple
is-
weeks ago. Mrs. Miller, did you want to
So
say something?
Mrs. Miller has a contract the same way, but it's written in here that she gets $170, or that
Sure.
it's billed $170 for each individual person. So you're about to vote on a contract that you don't know what you're voting on, is what you're saying.
Mrs. Miller? We've had the information previously, Mr.
Why don't you tell me
Risley.
how much it is then?
Because it's,
No, it's not 170 cases, it's a different whole thing.
She wants to speak.
Okay.
We would have absolutely no idea how much the contract is.
So you all said that you were voting on something that you knew what it was and that you had the information before. This is why I'm running for city council,
Check.
because you guys are about to vote on something that you have no idea what you're voting on.
we got a listing, Mrs. Miller.
And when the contract would be presented to you, Mr. Risley, if you were successful, you would not know what the amount is either, because it's not known until the defendants appear before the court, are convicted, they're represented, and then they are billed.
Sure. And then
So
what
you're
was-
agreeing.
what's the
well,
average for the
let me-
last 3 or 4 years of
Let
that?
me answer the question that you asked. Then so the defendant appears before the court, he's represented, the public defender's office bills us per case once they're finished representing them, and the judges enter an order in that service has been received by the court. Then we receive a bill quarterly from the public defender's office. So that's how, they can't bill us for a case they haven't provided a service for. We are agreeing that we will pay $170 per case. So that's what we're agreeing to.
Are we talking about what you're doing as a public defender, or are we talking about?
I'm not a public defender. We are entering into an agreement with the Summit County Public Defender's Office.
There's two
He's
different
asking
agreements.
about Oriana
No,
House.
I-
he asked also about the public defender's
Right.
office.
Correct, but I said that yours was dictated in 170, we actually know what that is.
Right.
That's what I said, that we already
Yeah,
knew what
well-
yours was. But I'm asking them about the Oriana thing that's not even on here, they're about to vote on it. And
Chair, if
they
I may.
give me even an average of what happened for the last 3 to 4 years.
Well, my understanding about the Oriana contract would be the exact same thing. It would be the service provided based on the IOP program or the driver intervention program, and they would have to be sentenced to that. And I don't think they would know how many people would be in the driver's intervention program until they're sentenced to the driver's intervention program.
but they could list on each one of those how much they are. I worked for Orient House for 5 years, and I was an accountant for 2 for them. So I understand how Orient House bills very, very directly, and I understand that if they're in RIP or TMRC, or if they're in a CBCF, those bases are completely different on pricing. I also understand that that pricing could increase throughout the year. So they're about to vote on a contract and say, yes, we'll go ahead and do this, and they don't even know what they're being billed for.
Well, actually, the city, I don't believe, pays for RIP or CBCF or DIP or any of those programs that are grant funded through the court.
Correct. The backside to that is they would have to be billing them for the other services they have. Why couldn't they just have a line item saying, if we have a person that gets convicted of this or has to go through this program, it's gonna cost X, Y, Z. At any point in time, Orient House can just jack up their price.
Right, which would still be paid for by a grant through the state of Ohio that's paid for,
Well, this is saying that they're entering into a financial contract. We're in the finance department, right?
right, the city of Barberton pays it.
We're in
But it's
safety.
grant funded through the state of Ohio. The city of Barberton isn't the funder, the state of Ohio is, but the grant's received by the city.
So then why would the city, if it's a grant received by the state of Ohio, have to go?
Well, I mean, the
Through
finance
the
director can explain how grant funds are received by the state and we enter into the contracts.
So, getting back to the main point, we're about to vote on something that we don't know what it's gonna cost us.
Chair, if I may.
Yes, Mr. Heidick.
Thank you, Chair. When I first got on the council, Director Miller, did I inquire if there were any other companies that provided the service of Oriana? And we talked, and there are none, correct? That provide what the courts need.
Sure, the Barberton Municipal Court has chosen to contract with Oriana House. I don't believe that other providers exist in Summit County. If there are, then they could choose to enter into those contracts, but the Barberton Municipal Court has presented Barberton City Council with a contract to Oriana House.
Correct.
And those services are paid by corrections grants through the state of Ohio.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Miller. Thank you, Mr. Heidick.
So again, I just asked the question, does anybody know how much this is gonna cost?
No, they don't. Because of the fact that we don't know how many cases will be in.
So real quick, Mr. Greer has some type of paperwork that he's stating that has those costs on it, but all of you are about to vote on something that you have no idea, not one of you
We
read
got
this.
the
we were all
costs
provided
as
with
well,
that.
Mr. Risley.
I asked every single one of you, thank you, ma'am. I asked every single one of you, if one of you could tell me how much it costs, and not one of you can. You want me to start going through this real quick and quizzing you
No.
on how much it costs?
We
No.
want Mrs. Miller to speak.
Okay.
I don't, the city of Barberton's general fund is not paying for this service. They're grant funded through the corrections grants through the state of Ohio.
Okay. We're entering into an open-ended contract. I mean, they can charge whatever they want. Yeah, they can. because
Exactly.
then
Joyce,
I'll
Mrs.
challenge any
Coburn.
one person to show me that it's paid 100% by the grant. Because then we'll have a liability. Because if they jack it up, I'm just using a stupid example, but if they jack it up to $10,000 for our services, and that grant only covers so much, and I guarantee you, written in that grant, it only covers so much. It doesn't say an open-ended check from the state of Ohio. So I'll challenge anybody that shows me in this paperwork that it's covered. Can't do it. Go ahead.
Mrs. Coburn first and then Mrs.
We have had this contract every year in the 8 years that I've been here, and not once has a dime come out of general fund to pay for this. We're not voting on how much. We're voting on the courts being allowed to use Oriana House.
Sure. You're still entering into a contract that you have a legal liability to. Correct?
No,
What do you mean, no? So
The
state of Ohio
courts have
grant is
it.
endless? I work for Oriana House, I can tell you, I've
Yeah,
seen their
but
billing
we're not-
cycles and what they do, and they aren't exactly always the same.
Mrs. Bailey.
I should probably refrain.
You
Okay.
can go ahead.
No.
Anyone else? Now, do I have a motion to adjourn? You made the first motion. Do I have a second? Mr. Griffin. And we are adjourned at 6:20 PM.
Next up, Grove Marketing and Development, Mr. Griffin.
Thank you, Mr. President. Time is 6:20. I would like to call this meeting to order today on April 24th. We're meeting in council chambers. All members are present, including guests is noted. Tonight, we have no request for legislation, but we do have some pending legislation. Title CDBG Annual Action Plan Amendment, an ordinance of the Council of the City of Barberton to approve the amended fiscal year 2022 Community Development Block Grant CDBG Annual Action Plan, AAP, and declaring it an emergency. We'll be voting on that tonight. Do we have any discussion from anybody in the council or the gallery? Hearing none. Do we have a motion to adjourn?
I'll make that motion.
Thank you, Mrs. Thompson.
I will second that.
Thank you, Mr. Heidick. We adjourn at
Is that your
6:23.
phone? Somebody's phone is buzzing. It's not mine.
Anybody hear your phone?
Thank you, Mr. Griffin. Next up is City Utilities with Mrs. Coach.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to call to order City Utilities. It's April 24th, 2023. It is 6:22. All members are present and others as noted. I'm the chair. Mrs. Fry and Erica Bailey are on the committee with me. We have no new requests for legislation. We have pending legislation for the designation of applicant's agent, a resolution authorizing the mayor or his designee to enter into to execute a grant agreement with the Ohio Department of Public Safety, Ohio Emergency Management Agency, and the City of Barberton in the amount of $975,000 for Phase 1 of the Barberton Wolf Creek Dam upgrade. This is a grant application agreement, and we're very lucky to have that coming up. We'll be voting on that tonight. We also have the appropriation of Wolf Creek Dam upgrade project with Mr. Heidick in finance. We'll be voting on that one tonight. We have an enter into contract with Burgess and Nyepel Wolf Creek Dam upgrade project, Phase 1. That will also be voted on tonight, and that is not to exceed $944,000, and we're declaring an emergency on all three of these so that we can move forward in a speedy manner. Yes, we want to get it done so that we can get started as soon as possible. Is there any discussion on the dam? We're all very excited for this to have gone through finally. Is there any miscellaneous discussion for utilities? From the audience? Hearing none, do I have a motion to adjourn?
I'll make a motion to adjourn.
I will second that.
Okay, we are adjourned at 6:24.
Thank you, Mr. Coburn. Last but not least, Finance Personnel, Mr. Heidick.
Thank you, Mr. President. Finance and Personnel, it is 6:23, Monday, April 24th, 2023. We're in council chambers. The committee is present, which consists of Councilors Coburn, Thompson, President Greer, and myself as chair. The rest noted. Tonight, we have no requests as we reserve those for the committee of the whole night. Our pending legislation, Ordinance 56, 2023, authorize payment Life Force Management for the Director of Finance to pay an invoice to Life Force Management in the amount of $5,942.39 for EMS collection fees for November of 2022. Any remarks there? Moving on, Ordinance 60, 2023, appropriation for the Wolf Creek Dam Upgrade Project Phase 1 appropriating $105,000 from the unappropriated item of the Water Improvement Reserve Fund to the capital budget of the Water Improvement Fund, declaring an emergency. Did anybody think of any questions in the last 2 minutes? Okay. Moving on, ordinance 63, 2023, enter into contract, SNC Construction Company LLC, authorizing the mayor or his designee to enter into contract with SNC Construction Company LLC and the lowest and/or best bidder for improvements to Barberton Fire Station 1 in the amount of $118,735 and declaring an emergency. Are there any comments here? Moving on, ordinance 64, 2023, PTJWE Consulting LLC, Topcraft, CRA abatement, authorizing the mayor via the planning director to submit to the state of Ohio a business application for tax incentives on behalf of PTJWE Consulting LLC, Topcraft, for a 100% 15-year tax abatement for the business expansion/improvements to 175 Second Street Southwest and declaring an emergency. Any comments here? All right.
I got a question right there, Pete.
Just a comment. Since we're not able to technically take a vote on this until after the school board formally approves this, they will be voting on this on Wednesday. We scheduled a meeting between the business owner and the school district, and it was a very deliberative and productive meeting. So we hope that all goes well for our Wednesday meeting, but that's why we'll be having a special meeting next Monday in order to formally vote on this.
Thank you. Any other comments? All right, into miscellaneous discussion from the committee,
I have nothing.
Yeah, none.
from the body, from the gallery. Seeing none, do I have a motion to adjourn?
I'll make that motion.
Thank you.
I'll second.
Thank you. We are adjourned at 6:26.
Thank you, Mr. Heidick. That concludes our individual committee meetings this evening. We'll take a 5-minute break and begin our regular legislative meeting. Wait.
Oh, yeah. I thought I gave you the only one.
Who's going to tell?
Nobody.
Nobody.
All right, we're going to begin. Today is Monday, April 24th, 2023. It is 6:35 PM. This is a regular legislative meeting of the Barberton City Council. I bring this meeting to order again at 6:35. Please stand for the Pledge of Allegiance, followed by the invocation by myself. I pledge
allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Lord, help us be open-minded, compassionate, and steadfast on our beliefs today. Always watch over the first responders. Never forget the 22. And thank you for the awesome weather. Amen.
All of them.
It'd be boring if we knew what the weather was going to be.
Clerk, please call the roll.
Yeah.
President Greer.
Present.
Mr. Heidick.
Here.
Mrs. Thompson.
Here.
Mrs. Bailey. Here. Mrs. Angela.
Here.
Mr. Griffin.
Here.
Mr. Jaber.
Here.
Mrs. Coburn.
Here.
Mrs. Fry.
Here.
All right, approval of the minutes. Approval of minutes of the regular legislative meeting held on Monday, April 10th, 2023. Mr. Heidick.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move to approve the minutes of the regular legislative meeting from Monday, April 10th, 2023.
And Mrs. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to second Mr. Heidick's motion to approve the minutes from Monday, April 10th, 2023.
Thank you. It was moved by Mr. Heidick and seconded by Mrs. Thompson to approve the minutes of the regular legislative meeting held on Monday, April 10th, 2023, as presented. Are there any remarks? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? All right, minutes are adopted. Acceptance of the finance report, our Finance Department report for the month of March 2023, as presented. Mr. Heidick.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move to accept the finance report from the month of March 2023 as presented.
Mrs. Coburn?
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to second that motion on suspension, on approval of the
That's
approval of the finance report.
Thank you, Mrs. Coburn.
I'll spit it out.
It was moved by Mr. Heidick and seconded by Mrs. Coburn to accept the finance report for the month of March 2023 as presented. Are there any remarks? All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Financial report is accepted. Petitions and claims.
We have none.
Thank you. Matters requested.
They have all been dispersed.
Citizens addressing council. There was none. First reading of ordinances and resolutions.
Ordinance number 56-2023, presented by Mr. Heidick. Title, Authorized Payment Life Force Management. An ordinance authorizing the Director of Finance to pay an invoice to Life Force Management in the amount of $5,942.39 for EMS collection fees for the November of 2022.
Motion to suspend, Mr. Heidick.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that the rules required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter be suspended.
Thank you. Mrs. Coburn?
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to second that motion on suspension.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mr. Heidick and seconded by Mrs. Coburn to suspend the rule as required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on suspension.
Mr. Jaber?
Yes.
Mr. Heidick?
Yes.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Mrs. Bailey? Yes. Mrs. Fry?
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Mrs. Coburn?
Yes.
Mrs. Angela?
Yes.
Motion for suspension carries. Motion to adopt. Mr. Heidick?
Thank you, Mr. President. I move to adopt ordinance 56-2023.
Thank you. Mrs. Coburn?
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to second that motion on adoption.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mr. Heidick and seconded by Mrs. Coburn to adopt ordinance number 56-2023. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on adoption.
Mr. Heidick?
Yes.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Mrs. Bailey?
Yes.
Mr. Jaber?
Yes.
Mrs. Fry?
Yes.
Mrs. Angela?
Yes.
Mrs. Coburn?
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Motion for adoption carries.
Resolution number 57-2023, presented by Mrs. Coburn. Title, Designation of the Applicant's Agent. A resolution authorizing the mayor or his designee to execute a grant agreement with the Ohio Department of Public Safety, Ohio Emergency Management Agency, and the City of Barberton in the amount of $975,000 for Phase 1 of the Barberton Wolf Creek Dam Upgrade Project.
Thank you. Motion to suspend, Mrs. Coburn.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that the rule is required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter be suspended.
Thank you. Mrs. Fry.
Thank you, Mr. President. I second Mrs. Coburn's motion to suspend.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mrs. Coburn and seconded by Mrs. Fry to suspend the rule as required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on suspension.
Mrs. Bailey?
Yes.
Mrs. Fry?
Yes.
Mrs. Angela?
Yes.
Mr. Heidick?
Yes.
Mr. Jaber?
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Mrs. Coburn?
Yes.
Motion for suspension carries. Motion to adopt. Mrs.
Thank you,
Coburn.
Mr. President. I move for the adoption of Resolution number 57, 2023.
Thank you. Mrs. Fry.
Thank you, Mr. President. I second Mrs. Coburn's motion to adopt Resolution 57, 2023.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mrs. Coburn and seconded by Mrs. Fry to adopt Resolution number 57-2023. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on adoption.
Mrs. Coburn?
Yes.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Jaber?
Yes.
Mr. Heidick?
Yes.
Mrs. Angela?
Yes.
Mrs. Fry?
Yes.
Mrs. Bailey?
Yes.
Motion for adoption carries.
Ordinance number 58-2023, presented by Mr. Griffin. Title, CDBG Annual Action Plan Amendment. An ordinance of the Council of the City of Barberton to approve the amended fiscal year 2022 Community Development Block Grant, CDBG Annual Action Plan, AAP, and declaring an emergency.
Thank you. Motion to suspend, Mr. Griffin.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that the rule as required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter be suspended.
Thank you. Mrs. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to second Mr. Griffin's motion to suspend.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mr. Griffin and seconded by Mrs. Thompson to suspend the rule as required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on suspension.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Mrs. Angela?
Yes.
Mrs. Bailey?
Yes.
Mr. Heidick?
Yes.
Mrs. Coburn?
Yes.
Mrs. Fry?
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Jaber?
Yes.
Thank you. Motion for suspension carries. Motion to adopt, Mr. Griffin.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move for the adoption of ordinance 58-2023.
Thank you. Mrs. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to second Mr. Griffin's motion to adopt.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mr. Griffin and seconded by Mrs. Thompson to adopt ordinance number 58-2023. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on adoption.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Jaber?
Yes.
Mrs. Coburn?
Yes.
Mrs. Fry?
Yes.
Mrs. Bailey?
Yes.
Mr. Heidick?
Yes.
Mrs. Angela?
Yes.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Thank you. Motion for adoption carries.
Ordinance number 59-2023, presented by Mrs. Fry. Title, Enter into Contract Oriana House. An ordinance authorizing the mayor to enter into a one-year contract with Oriana House Incorporated for the 2023 Community Corrections Contract and declaring an emergency.
Thank you. Motion to suspend, Mrs. Fry.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that the rules required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter be suspended.
Thank you. Mr. Griffin.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to second Mrs. Fry's motion on suspension.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mrs. Fry and seconded by Mr. Griffin to suspend the rule as required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on suspension.
Mr. Jaber?
No.
Mr. Heidick?
Yes.
Mr. Griffin,
Yes.
Mrs. Angeloff,
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson,
Yes.
Mrs. Coburn,
Yes.
Mrs. Bailey,
Yes.
Mrs. Fry.
Yes.
All right. Motion for suspension carries. Motion to adopt, Mrs. Fry.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move for the adoption of ordinance number 59-2023.
Thank you. And Mr. Griffin?
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to second Mrs. Fry's motion on adoption.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mrs. Fry and seconded by Mr. Griffin to adopt ordinance number 59-2023. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on adoption.
Mrs. Fry,
Yes.
Mrs. Bailey,
Yes.
Mrs. Coburn,
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson,
Yes.
Mrs. Angeloff,
Yes.
Mr. Griffin,
Yes.
Mr. Heidick,
Yes.
Mr. Jaber.
No.
Motion for adoption carries.
Ordinance number 60-2023, presented by Mrs. Coburn and Mr. Heidick. Title, Appropriation, Wolf Creek Dam Upgrade Project, Phase 1. An ordinance appropriating $105,000 from the unappropriated item of the Water Improvement Reserve Fund to the capital budget of the Water Improvement Fund and declaring an emergency.
Thank you. Motion to suspend, Mrs. Coburn.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that the rule as required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter be suspended.
Thank you. And Mr. Heidick?
Thank you, Mr. President. I will second Councilor Coburn's motion on suspension.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mrs. Coburn and seconded by Mr. Heidick to suspend the rule as required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on suspension.
Mrs. Angeloff?
Yes.
Mrs. Fry?
Yes.
Mr. Jaber?
Yes.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Mrs. Bailey?
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Mrs. Coburn?
Yes.
Mr. Heidick?
Yes.
Motion for suspension carries. Motion to adopt, Mrs. Coburn.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move for the adoption of ordinance number 60-2023.
Thank you. Mr. Heidick?
Thank you, Mr. President. I will second that motion to adopt.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mrs. Coburn and seconded by Mr. Heidick to adopt ordinance number 60-2023. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on adoption.
Mrs. Bailey?
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Mrs. Coburn?
Yes.
Mr. Heidick?
Yes.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Mr. Jaber?
Yes.
Mrs. Angeloff?
Yes.
Mrs. Fry?
Yes.
Thank you. Motion for adoption carries.
Ordinance number 61-2023, presented by Mrs. Coburn. Title, Enter into Contract Burgess and Nyepel Wolf Creek Dam Upgrade Project, Phase 1. An ordinance authorizing the mayor to enter into a professional engineering service contract with Burgess and Nyepel for the Wolf Creek Dam Upgrade Project, Phase 1, design, bidding, and construction services in the amount of not to exceed $944,000 and declaring an emergency.
Thank you. Motion to suspend, Mrs. Coburn.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that the rule as required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter be suspended.
Thank you. Mrs. Fry?
Thank you, Mr. President. I second Mrs. Coburn's motion to suspend.
Thank you. Motion was made by Mrs. Coburn and seconded by Mrs. Fry to suspend the rule as required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on suspension.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Heidick?
Yes.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Mrs. Fry?
Yes.
Mrs. Angela?
Yes.
Mrs. Coburn?
Yes.
Mr. Jaber?
Yes.
Mrs. Bailey?
Yes.
Motion for suspension carries. Motion to adopt, Mrs. Coburn.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move for the adoption of ordinance number 61-2023.
Thank you. Mrs. Fry?
Thank you, Mr. President. I second Mrs. Coburn's motion to adopt.
A motion was made by Mrs. Coburn and seconded by Mrs. Fry to adopt ordinance number 61-2023. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on adoption.
Mrs. Bailey?
Yes.
Mr. Jaber?
Yes.
Mrs. Coburn?
Yes.
Mrs. Angela?
Yes.
Mrs. Fry?
Yes.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Mr. Heidick?
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Motion for adoption carries.
Ordinance number 62-2023, presented by Mrs. Fry. Title, enter into contract, Law Department Defender's Office of Summit County. An ordinance authorizing the law director to enter into a one-year contract with the Legal Defender's Office of Summit County to provide legal representation to indigent persons in the amount of $170 per case and declaring an emergency.
Thank you. Motion to suspend, Mrs. Fry.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that the rule as required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter be suspended.
Thank you. Mr. Griffin?
Thank you, Mr. President. I want to second Mrs. Fry's motion on suspension.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mrs. Fry and seconded by Mr. Griffin to suspend the rule as required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on suspension.
Mr. Heidick?
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Mrs. Fry?
Yes.
Mrs. Coburn?
Yes.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Mrs. Bailey?
Yes.
Mr. Jaber?
Yes.
Mrs. Angela?
Yes.
Motion for suspension carries. Motion to adopt. Mrs. Fry.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move for the adoption of ordinance number 62-2023.
Thank you. Mr. Griffin?
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to second Mrs. Fry's motion on adoption.
A motion was made by Mrs. Fry and seconded by Mr. Griffin to adopt ordinance number 62-2023. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on adoption.
Mrs. Coburn?
Yes.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Mrs. Fry?
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Heidick?
Yes.
Mrs. Angela?
Yes.
Mr. Jaber?
Yes.
Mrs. Bailey?
Yes.
Motion for adoption carries.
Ordinance number 63-2023, presented by Mrs. Fry and Mr. Heidick. Title, enter into contract SNC Construction Company LLC. An ordinance authorizing the mayor or his designee to enter into contract with SNC Construction Company LLC, the lowest and/or best bidder for improvements to Barberton Fire Station 1 in the amount of $118,735 and declaring an emergency.
Motion to suspend, Mrs. Fry.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that the rules required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter be suspended.
Thank you. Mr. Heidick?
Thank you, Mr. President. I will second Councilor Fry's motion on suspension.
Thank you. Motion was made by Mrs. Fry and seconded by Mr. Heidick to suspend the rule as required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on suspension.
Mr. Jaber?
Yes.
Mrs. Fry?
Yes.
Mrs. Bailey?
Yes.
Mrs. Coburn?
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Heidick?
Yes.
Mrs. Angela?
Yes.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Thank you. Motion for suspension carries. Motion to adopt, Mrs. Fry.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move for the adoption of ordinance number 63-2023.
Thank you. Mr. Heidick?
Thank you, Mr. President. I will second the motion to adopt.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mrs. Fry and seconded by Mr. Heidick to adopt ordinance number 63-2023. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on adoption.
Mrs. Bailey?
Yes.
Mrs. Coburn?
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Mrs. Angela?
Yes.
Mr. Heidick?
Yes.
Mr. Jaber?
Yes.
Mrs. Fry?
Yes.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Motion for adoption carries.
Ordinance number 64-2023, presented by Mrs. Thompson and Mr. Heidick. Title, PTJWE Consulting LLC, Topcraft, CRA abatement. An ordinance authorizing the mayor via the planning director to submit to the state of Ohio a business application for tax incentives on behalf of PTJWE Consulting LLC, Topcraft, for a 100% 15-year tax abatement for the business expansion improvements to 175 2nd Street Southwest and declaring an emergency. This is a first reading. The second reading will be at a special legislative meeting to be held on Monday, May 1st, immediately following the committee of the whole meeting on that date. This ends the first readings.
Thank you. Second reading of ordinances and resolutions.
Ordinance number 55-2023, presented by Mrs. Bailey. Title, enter into contract, RIP medical debt. An ordinance authorizing the mayor to enter into contract with RIP medical debt in the amount not to exceed $110,000 and declaring an emergency.
Thank you. I have this marked down as voting. This is going to vote tonight. All right, motion to suspend, Mrs. Bailey.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that the rule as required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter be suspended.
Thank you. And Mr. Jaber?
Thank you, Mr. President. I would second Ms. Bailey's suspension. Motion.
Suspension.
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Jaber. Motion was made by Mrs. Bailey and seconded by Mr. Jaber to suspend the rule as required by Section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter. Are there any remarks? Clerk, please call the roll on suspension.
Mrs. Bailey?
Yes.
Mrs. Frye?
Yes.
Mrs. Angela?
Yes.
Mr. Heidick?
Yes.
Mr. Jaber?
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Mrs. Coburn?
Yes.
Thank you. Motion for suspension carries. Motion to adopt, Mrs. Bailey.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move for the adoption of ordinance number 55-2023.
Thank you. And Mr. Jaber?
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to second Mrs. Bailey's motion for adoption.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mrs. Bailey and seconded by Mr. Jaber to adopt ordinance number 55-2023. Are there any remarks? Mr. Heidick.
Thank you, Mr. President. It's known I've had my reservations about this. In our last discussion, I had time to think. There were issues brought that certain things were targeting certain people. Bus for the senior center. Well, not everybody's a senior, but they eventually will be. You know, a splash pad. Not everybody is splash pad age appropriate. A 1-month-old may not use it, but a 1-year-old may. It was brought up the Safe Streets grant. We're not going to tear up the sidewalk at the end of the year. These projects are lasting, and I made clear that I had great respect for this program. I just was hesitant with the funding. What boosted my confidence today is when I opened up my mailbox and I see a request dated April 21st that the mayor will submit an application to Tuscarora Health and Wellness Foundation to assist us in this. Did everybody receive that in their mailbox? This here gives me confidence. That's all I have to say.
Thank you, Mr. Heidick. Is there any other remarks? Mr. Jaber?
Thank you, Mr. President. I'll have to piggyback after Mr. Heidick, and I give 100%, 100% just acknowledgement and also respect for Mr. Heidick for following through with this and asking questions to make this possible. And like I said, just one email that we sent out, we're getting money back, helping out with the city through the foundation. And hopefully we can move forward with this, and the foundation can also do other things in the future with this. Thank you.
I'd also like to say.
Thank you, Mr. Jaber. Is there any other comments?
I would just like to thank Mayor Judge. He was very quick in responding to the foundation, giving them any information that they needed. I mean, within an hour of them sending, I think you responded with everything they needed. So thank you for that and making it possible.
Thank you. Is there any other comments or remarks? All right. Clerk, please call the roll on adoption.
Mrs. Coburn?
Yes.
Mr. Griffin?
Yes.
Mrs. Thompson?
Yes.
Mr. Jaber?
Yes.
Mr. Heidick?
Yes.
Mrs. Angela?
Yes.
Mrs. Frye?
Yes.
Mrs. Bailey?
Yes.
Motion for adoption carries.
This ends the second readings.
Third reading of ordinances and resolutions.
We have none.
Miscellaneous and unfinished business. We have an appointment. Did you want to read that?
The appointment is to the City of Barberton's Parks Commission. It's for Mr. Robert Martin to begin immediately to fulfill an unexpired term ending December 31st, 2027.
Do I have a motion to appoint Mr. Martin? Mr. Jaber?
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to call the motion to appoint Mr. Robert Martin to begin to fill an unexpired term ending December 31st, 2027.
Thank you. Mr. Heidick?
Thank you, Mr. President. I will second the motion for the appointment.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mr. Jaber and seconded by Mr. Heidick to appoint Mr. Robert Martin to the City of Barberton Parks Commission. Are there any remarks? All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? All right. Motion for the appointment carries. Communication from the body. Is there anything from council members? Mr. Griffin?
I'd like to say something about the cleanup we had over the weekend in the city. I think it was really good compared to the foul weather we had. I think I got pretty wet. But I want to thank the girls, the young women and young men of the Scouts that cleaned up Elson Avenue on the east end. They really did a good job. They were out there in the bushes getting old tires and gas can. It was a gas can that still had gas in it, so you can figure that one out. And barbecue grills, and they did a tremendous job. And I just want to give them credit. They're from the troop across from the Y. I did have the troop numbers, but I forgot them. But it was two different scout troops, so I just want to give a thanks to them for doing a super job.
Thank you, Mr. Griffin. Is there anything else from the body? Anything from the department heads? I do have one thing here. Before the meeting, I mentioned and asked that anybody in the body responding to council, please step up to the podium. That's more of a request because we have media reaching out to council, not knowing who's talking or not knowing what's being said, and then our clerk cannot take notes because sometimes the audio is being recorded up here. It doesn't come through the microphone, and we have inaudible minutes. So moving forward, I'd like to offer all the seats over here to the department heads and administration. At one point, they did sit back here. When COVID hit and we all kind of changed, that we still separated a little bit. So I would like to offer the city administration and department heads to sit in a seat. You can pick one. If it's new to you, the idea is new to you. And obviously there's some that know about or where they can sit. So with that, I'm also entertaining the idea of putting drop microphones and a third or second camera in here to point towards the gallery from the back corner and drop microphones. I know some have asked if that back camera records. It does not, but we will start recording the gallery if we can't get people to come up and to stand and speak. So again, administration and department heads, you guys are more than welcome to sit above or in front of the railing at the seats along the side and the mayor's seat too as well. And that is all I have. So communication from the mayor.
Thank you, Mr. President. First, with the passage of ordinance 55, 2023, thank you for that. As Councilman Heidig did mention, I did submit a request to council, a resolution to apply to the foundation, Tuscarora's Health and Wellness, for a grant for the same purpose. So this just gets the ball rolling. So their deadline is June 1st. That'll be in front of Health Committee next week, and then hopefully passage the week after that. We're still working with RIP. And again, the estimates that they gave, the rough estimates, is this would help 4,000 residents, $10 million in uncollected medical debt, and would cost approximately $110,000. So if we can get money from the foundation, that would help out and reduce what's coming from the city of Barberton. But I will keep you updated on that as we go through. Obviously, as I mentioned the first time, this is a very lengthy process. Could take 6 to 8 months to get really nailed down who Barberton residents are and the debt, to get accurate numbers. Obviously, there's a lot of people who live outside of Barberton who are still 44203, and still a lot of people who live outside of Barberton but have a Barberton mailing address. So they will really dig down into that. So I'll have more information soon. And piggybacking off of what others had said, Councilman Griffin and others, thanks to the Parks Department and all the volunteers who came out this weekend despite the weather for Take Pride in Barberton Day. Had a good turnout and a lot of good cleaning up in the downtown area of the parks, and as Mr. Griffin said, over there in Elson and Frank. And I wish we would have taken before and after pictures because it's remarkable, totally different. And as Mr. Griffin, Councilman Griffin said, they didn't just get the things on the outside that you could see. They went back in the woods, and I know that wasn't easy because it was muddy and very sloppy back there. But totally two different worlds it looks like there. We also had the drug take-back program this past weekend, which is a national program. So both programs have always had such a positive impact on the community. So thank you to the Kiwanis and the Scout troops and other volunteers who did a great job. I also want to thank White Rabbit Galleries and the Barberton City Schools art teachers. and all the students and the programs and the talented students that they have. This past weekend, White Rabbit had some art pieces from the students, and just some remarkable students that are just doing amazing things in the area of art here in the city. So thank you to them. This past week, one of the exciting parts of my job is to work and meet with the third graders that come through each year. So they take a tour of the Diamond Party Center, the Magical Theater, the library, and City Hall here. So I've got a lot of pictures and artifacts, personal, that I get to show off to them, plates and things like that. So it's always a great turnout and a lot of good questions. So thank you to the schools for that. There's a few new businesses in town. We're getting ready to schedule those ribbon cuttings, and we've been working with them for a while, so more information coming soon on those. Change for Change is this Friday at El Jalapeno's, benefiting the school's financial literacy program. And then just finally, former Barberton football coach Rudy Sharkey passed away this past weekend. He was a great champion of and for the Barberton community and the Barberton people. He was also an assistant coach at Mount Union. So when I was in college, we'd play Mount Union, kind of get after the games, get an earful of what I could have done better or what the team could have done better, even though he wasn't our coach. But always a lot of knowledge, a lot of good advice. And so he's going to be deeply missed. But please keep him and his family in our prayers. Any questions? All right, thank you.
Thank you, Mayor. With nothing else, do I have a motion to adjourn? Mr. Heidick?
Thank you, Mr. President. I will motion to adjourn.
Mrs. Thompson?
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to second that motion.
Thank you. It was moved by Mr. Heidick and seconded by, Mr. Heidick and seconded by Mrs. Thompson that we adjourn. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? I didn't think so.